Hey everybody, Blaise here, and I'm super excited to introduce to you my friend Ken Spirduso. Say hi, Ken.
Hello, how are y'all doing?
So, Ken and I have known each other for almost 30 years now.
Yes.
We met way back in the early days, right after Aladdin, back at Disney. Talk about some of your history. What have you been doing?
Well, I did start right as Aladdin made it through the layout department. Prior to that, I worked in Ireland with Don Bluth, and then worked at Disney for 12 years. I've done freelance work for Imagineering and worked on video games, fine art, but really my favorite thing to do is to draw and paint portraits. So I'm very thankful for this opportunity to teach about portrait drawing.
Yeah, and I remember back in the day, I remember, you were always out there landscape painting. I remember you painting portraits. I remember you going to every workshop that we always had.
That's right.
You always had your easel set up and you're right there. So you've got a great guy right here coming in to teach you this. And so over the last few days, we've been shooting an introduction to portrait drawing, correct?
Yes.
What can they expect to find in the course?
Well, it's a basic overview of portrait drawing. So we're going to start from the basics. It's something that you can do both traditionally and digitally. So I think it should be a big help for you. Yeah,
I've been looking over his shoulder, obviously, as he's been doing the shoot. And what I really love is just Ken's approach to explaining planes, shapes, anatomy, all the things that you really need to understand to draw accurate portraits, not just drawing good people, but also drawing likenesses, which is really important for a lot of people that want to draw family, friends, that sort of thing.
I've had a lot of experience teaching online and in person from ages middle school up through college and graduate level. So it's really an exciting time for me to share what I know with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the class.
So head on over to creatureartteacher.com and check out Ken Spirduso's Introduction to Drawing Portraits. It's going to be a great one. Go on out there, put some beauty back into the world, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ken Spirduso. In this series, we'll be covering the basics of portrait drawing. One of my fondest memories of being a dad is reading to our children. And I can remember reading to our son when he got old enough, and I could read to him a book that my dad had given me. And it was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And it was the Sherlock Holmes series. And we got to an episode where Dr. Watson is frustrated that he apparently can't see the same evidence or information that Sherlock Holmes can. And he blurts out, "I believe my eyes are as good as yours." To which Holmes responds, "Quite so. You see, but you do not observe." And he goes on to explain that it's not that he sees different information from everyone else, but that he actually observes the same information in a different way. And what struck me is that's exactly what artists do. And that's what we'll be doing in this series. We'll be learning different techniques and gaining tools that will help you observe what's in front of you so that you can capture a human face and capture the likeness. So let's get started. So let's start by looking at the basic principles of portrait drawing. And a good place to start is to ask a question, why is it difficult to draw in the first place? Why is portrait drawing so hard? And I think it goes back to a phase that we go through when we're little, when we're learning to draw, and we rely on symbols. And it's an important phase to go through. But unfortunately, those symbols can become embedded in our imaginations. So when a young child draws a pine tree, for instance, and draws a triangle with a stem, and then later, when that same young person wants to draw a real pine tree, it can become difficult because those symbols pop up, almost like pop-up ads, and they get in the way of what's actually there. So shapes are really the answer. Looking at shapes will help you to avoid or bypass those learned images so that you're drawing what's there, not what you think is there. So we'll talk a lot about negative shapes, and that's one way of actually focusing on what's presented before you. So if you were going to draw this candle holder You can see that there's some complex shapes, there are some proportion issues, but if you look to either side of that candle holder, you can see that there is a mirrored image of a man's profile. If you were to focus on the profile and draw that, it's a little bit easier than that complex shape of the candle holder. If you were to do that, then by default, you'd actually draw the candle holder. So that's what we do with negative shapes. We look to the next door neighbor shape, always looking to the other shape, which usually is easier to draw. And you'll notice also in this diagram that these shapes really come to life because you're paying attention to both the positive and the negative shapes. So that's good to remember. One of the best ways of learning to see negative shapes is an exercise called memory drawing. And you can start with a very simple silhouette or use one like I have here. It's a cowboy on a quarter horse. So you take a silhouette and you make sure that your square creates a tangent or touches the silhouette. So it creates enclosed shapes that you can study. And then what you do is while you're studying the memory drawing silhouette, you look at one shape, and we can take this first shape, maybe it's the one between the hind legs of the horse, and without drawing, you just stare at that shape until it becomes a recognizable shape. And then you turn off the silhouette or put it away, and you try to draw that shape from memory. And then when you're done, you put your pencil down and you bring that silhouette back up, and then you make the corrections in your head. You don't pick up your pencil while the silhouette is in view. You just look at what you've done and flash your eye back and forth. So you're constantly looking at the original shape and making those corrections with your memory rather than actually drawing. And as you continue to do that, your memory will be stronger. You can also go out and do shape finder exercises. Drawing clouds is a great thing to do. When we're young, we often do that. And it's a great exercise to look at the clouds and the shapes between the clouds so that you can get an idea of how those shapes really turn into objects that are recognizable. When I was growing up in Wisconsin during long winters, I found myself lying on my bed looking up at elm trees, and all the leaves had fallen, and I would look at the spaces between the branches and try to pick out a knight or a baseball bat or a dragon. And in a drawing like this, I've actually taken some of those shapes and dropped them in to the neighboring spaces, the neighboring shapes. So again, it helps you to develop that ability to look at negative shapes. Another exercise you can do is called upside down drawing. So you can take a drawing or a painting that you want to copy, and the idea is if you turn it upside down, you're no longer identifying the features, you're just seeing shapes. So you can start with one shape and then work outwards towards the borders. And think only of the shapes that are presented. You're not really trying to identify anything, you're just thinking of flat puzzle pieces that fit together. And this is actually how we'll approach our portrait drawing. So you move from shape to shape, and you can see that I've colored in one of those shapes in red. So let's say you were going to start with that shape. That's actually easier to draw, and most people could draw that shape. So you're just thinking of it as a flat puzzle piece. The challenge is not to think about the feature you're drawing, because as soon as you do, if you name that nose or that eye, up come those memorized symbols, and then it's going to be hard to actually see what's in front of you. So you always want to draw what's actually there. Another way of drawing with accuracy is flattening the form, because the 3D world is challenging to capture. So the masters throughout the centuries developed this technique of flattening the form because it's always easier to draw a flat shape than a shape that has dimension. And I think we already do this. If you look at a crescent moon in the night sky, even though we all know that's a ball, it has a round shape, we think of that crescent as a flat shape. So it's the same process when you're looking at shapes in a face. So if you can imagine taking a drawing, this is a drawing I did in school, a plaster cast drawing, or if you can imagine looking at an image and being able to pull those pieces apart, almost like those thick wooden puzzles we had when we were little, and you could take a piece out and look at it. If you can capture those different light and shadow shapes in that way, it makes them much easier to draw. So how do we do that? How do we flatten the form? One thing is you can cover an eye or close an eye, and that automatically flattens the form. You can also squint slightly, so as you look through your eyelashes, that can help flatten the form. You can do both, and that will definitely create more of a flat image. And then once you've captured that flat silhouette, then you can go back in and start modeling. So in this approach, we're really thinking of carving. So you can carve flat shapes, and then once you get those flat shapes, you can begin to sand the edges. When we're talking about shapes, we want to think of the light and shadow shapes that are presented. And if you look at this ball, you'll notice that the brightest area is perpendicular to the light source. So it's getting a direct hit from the light. And that's where your highlight is located. You can also see that as the ball rolls away from the light, it moves into the middle tone area. And that's still part of the light, but it's an important area. It's a third color if you're painting using color. It's something that is the most saturated because it's an area that's not bleached out by the light source. And so if you're painting, you can actually use more intensity in those colors, and it pulls those colors towards us because saturated color actually looks closer to us. So it's another way of adding dimension on top of capturing the values. So you want to look for those middle tones, and that's really where you can get a lot of your modeling. If you look just across the border into the shadow area, there's a core shadow. It's a dark band that runs right along the edge of the shadow, and it creates a great sense of dimension if you can capture that. You have the form shadow, which is actually just a part of the object that's turned away from the light source, and light can't bend around, so it's now darker. It's just protected from the light. If you look at the bottom of the ball, there's something called reflected light. If you think of light as almost like a super ball bouncing up and bouncing around, it hits the surface or anything nearby, and then it can ricochet onto surfaces that are turned towards that light. And you can see how the reflected light is hitting the bottom of the ball. The key there is to remember that reflected light is rarely as bright as we would think. It's actually quite dim, and so you can squint to see how it fits into a bigger field of value. And then you have your cast shadow, which is usually the darkest shadow because the light can't get to that area. Right underneath the object, you'll have a contact or an occlusion shadow, and that's super dark. And then as the shadow moves away from the object that's casting it, it gets lighter and gets a softer edge. So let's talk about the anatomy of the head so that we understand what actually causes those shapes that we see. So we'll start with the frontal bone. That's that big bone in the front of the skull. It actually can shine through and create a lot of luminosity in the portrait. You have the parietal bone, which is the side plane of the head. There's the superciliary crest. That's the eyebrow ridge. Now, it's much more prominent in men. It tends to be a much smoother transition in women, but it's a ledge there where you really catch a lot of light, and it's where the eyebrow sits. You have a glabella. It's this indentation between the two eyebrows. We have the nasal bone, which really is the only bone of the nose. Everything else is cartilage. The zygomatic bone is a really important bone because it really affects the shape of the face, and you can see how it creates part of the orbit of the eye, and then it reaches back towards the ear. You have the maxilla, which is the part of the mouth that does not move. It holds the upper teeth, and then the mandibula, which does move. And this is that strong jawbone that has that real strong angle. Combining the shapes is also important. So as you squint, you want to see the largest shadow and light shapes possible. So again, it's like carving. We'll go back in and find those smaller facets, those smaller shapes. But to start with, you definitely want to see big light and shadow shapes. You want to try to combine those shapes as much as possible so that the final drawing will retain that sense of light. Another way of looking at the face or a plaster cast and seeing those negative shapes is thinking of it as an island or a map. So if you imagined that map, you can think of the water that surrounds it. So for instance, if you were going to draw the United States, you could draw the Gulf of Mexico, and if you captured that shape, that would actually help you draw the coast of Texas and Louisiana and Alabama and Florida. So it's the same if you picture that face as a map. So in this case, you might have an inlet or a gulf. And so if you think of that air around the face as a solid, or in this case, an object like water, it can help capture that accurately. Using a mirror is very, very important. So a number of years ago, there was a study that was done, and they came out with a syndrome, and it was called house blindness. And apparently, if you have a messy house or a messy room, you get used to that mess. And it's not until you go off to vacation and come back that you're shocked at how messy it actually is. And I think that applies to drawing. After a while, we get used to the errors that we've made that maybe have snuck under the radar. And it's not until you look at it backwards that you really can see problems in proportion or placement. So constantly be looking at a mirror to see your work and the subject at the same time. Check your angles, check the proportions, check the location of your shapes. And never forget that looking at it backwards gives you that fresh eye so that you can correct those errors. The last thing I want to talk about is the gesture of the face. And this is something that came to me when I was waiting tables after I graduated from school, and I was walking through the restaurant, and I found that if I glanced at someone and then looked away and tried to capture their face in my imagination, that everyone had a certain gesture. It could be their expression that they usually held their face in. It could be the structure of their face. It could be a combination of the two. And that's something that you can look for when you're drawing portraits. So capturing a gesture, you want to look at the person's face and then quickly look away or close your eyes and try to retain that gesture in your imagination. Look for the overall shape, the expression, and the proportions, and those will all lend themselves to that gesture. You can actually do this in large crowds where you're passing people quite often. You can look and glance and look away. And as you're looking away, you can try to picture that face and see if you can capture the gesture of that face. So look for the asymmetrical qualities. Even though we have eyes, of course, that mirror one another, they're very rarely the same shape. And you can see that sometimes an eye might tip or might be higher than the other eye. So those are the qualities that lend themselves to that gesture. And then how the features and the person's expression combine to create a facial gesture. The more you study people, the more you can see how faces tend to set in a typical expression, and that can change the face. And then look for the underlying shape. So when you're looking at someone's head shape, you can either see an oval or a cube, a triangle, and that also can help capture that gesture. So those are the basics of portrait drawing. Those are the basic principles that we'll be using. So let's go ahead and jump into some drawing. Now that we've gone over the features, it's time to go after the entire head. So there are a number of ways you can draw. Some artists actually work from the outside in. They'll draw a large general shape, usually a simple geometric shape, and then find the features within. Or you can start from the inside and work out. That's the one I'm going to work on. We're still, though, going to try to find the biggest light and shadow shapes possible. So a number of years ago, I was doing a workshop with a portrait painter, and he said that when he was young, he had the assignment of drawing the United States. So he drew the outline of the United States, and he started at the East Coast and worked his way through all the states. Unfortunately, he was only at Kansas by the time he hit the West Coast. So he crumpled up that piece of paper and started again, and he started with Kansas, since that's in the very middle. And then he would go one state north and south and east and west, and he would work out to the contours. So I thought that was a good approach, and I tried it myself, and it's really a good way of capturing the proportion. So it's always being mindful of the outside contour, but starting with a shape that you can start with, maybe an eye shape or a shadow shape. You can gradually work out to that outside contour. So I will probably sketch in a rough outline of what I see, almost like an envelope of the features and the head and the shoulders. But then I will start from the inside and look for big light and shadow shapes. So let's get started. So let's remember that we can be very loose at this point. We're just trying to get something down. I can give myself a line through the eyes, an axis line that gives me an idea of the angle. And I'll probably erase all over this so I can lighten it so it doesn't get too dark. That's one thing you want to keep in mind. You don't want your initial lines to be so dark that they get in the way. That you just want to use them as directional lines or construction lines. So I'll erase those back. but I still can see them. In this case, in Photoshop, I also will put in a new layer. So as I put in another layer, that way I can always get back to that initial sketch stage, or I can turn it off if it's getting in the way. So now that I have that basic idea of where the face is going to go, I'll try to find a good place to start. And usually I think it's the enclosed shape that's the furthest shape away on a 3/4 view. So that's the furthest eye. And if you look at, say, the eyebrow and the nose and the upper lip and then the outside cheek, it's an enclosed shape that's fairly easy to find because it has sides on every side of the shape. So let's go ahead and start on that side. And I'll be squinting. So I'm just going to go in and rough in the angle of the nose. At this point, I'm not really considering all of the subtleties. I'm just trying to find basically the borderline. I'm going to use flat lines. Now, as I squint, a lot of this falls into shadow, but I'm still going to try to capture something of those interior shapes. Remember that whenever you draw one thing, you want to look at the surrounding area. You want to look at the neighboring shapes. And if you're drawing the eye, then you also have to look at the nose to make sure that that placement is correct. And one of the most important things when it comes to learning to draw or to paint is to begin to find your own areas of strengths and weaknesses. And the more aware you are of weaknesses or habits that you might have, then you can begin to work on those areas and root them out of your drawing. So I find that I tend to make shapes too big. So that's good information to have. So I'm always staying on myself not to exaggerate the shapes that I see. Sometimes it can be how you use your line. If you pull your line too much or too strongly, you can actually elongate the forms inadvertently. So try to pick up on those things as you work and try to figure out how you can improve, how you can make your work stronger. So I'm going to continue just to find these shapes. Now there's really a beautiful reflected light along her cheek. Remember that as you're drawing, you definitely want to squint because when you're looking through your eyelashes, through semi-closed eyes, you drop out a lot of those values you never really can capture. Our eyes are so powerful. They see subtle values that we really can't reproduce when it comes to drawing, either in a digital format or traditional. So when it comes to those reflected lights, I'm definitely going to squint and see how they fall into a larger value field. Now, we had talked about that upside down drawing approach where you're not really naming what you're drawing, and that really comes to play here as well. So as you're working on the face, at least at this point, as you're blocking it in, I would try not to focus on naming the features or thinking in terms of how that feature is constructed. There will be a time for that, and we can get into the anatomy, but right now we're just trying to find the basic shapes, and that actually can get in the way. So if you're naming the eye, remember those pop-up ads, those old symbolic images, they can pop up and get in the way, and then I'm really fighting myself to see what's there. So we want to draw what's there, not what we think is there. When we were drawing the nose, we talked about how easy it is to make the nose too long. So as I'm drawing here, I have that in the back of my mind, just making sure that I'm not falling into that trap of making her nose too long or the upper lip. So that's where I really need to lock on to those shapes. And I'll return to them again and again. So I find with measuring, it's not just a one-time practice. You really have to go back over and over again and continue to measure As you're blocking in, you might come to a shape that, even though you've studied the shape carefully and drawn what you see, it doesn't look right at that moment. I would leave it and just keep drawing. Quite often, once you get other shapes finished around it, then it does begin to look more accurate. So trust your eye. You can always go back in and rework it if it's not right. All right, so at this point, I'm going to go back in and just drop a tone onto this side so we can really put this back. I'm going to drop it back, push it away. So it's always easier to see that shape and to check the accuracy of that shape if it's a tone. And I talked about trying to find the largest shadow shape possible. So when you squint, you can see that her whole face is encompassed by that shadow, even her hair. So as we're blocking it in, we can try to block in that entire shadow shape. And then we can go back in and pull out the smaller shapes. So I'm just going to go back in and reestablish some of those shapes. When it comes to drawing the eye, we can look at the white of the eye, the sclera, stare at that and try to capture that shape. And if we draw that with accuracy, then we're actually drawing the upper lid and we're drawing the bottom lid. We're also drawing the iris. So make use of those negative shapes that really will help you draw with accuracy. You can also see from this direction, you can really see how the eye is wrapped by that lower lid, how that lower lid really wraps around like a balcony underneath the eye, and it catches just a little bit of light. Now the eyebrow seems like it should be much higher above the eye, but you can see from this angle how it's quite close as it dips down. So that's what we need to capture. We need to capture what we're seeing, not what we think ought to be there or what we expect to be there. Now there's a little triangle of light on her cheek, on our left, on her right cheek. And this is another area where we expect it to be much brighter than it actually is. And this is one of the few times that you really can't always trust your eye. It's an optical illusion. It always appears brighter than it is because it's surrounded by a dark area. So you want to make sure that in that instance, you're definitely squinting to see how that smaller shape, and it's usually on the shadow side on the cheek, falls into that bigger field of value. If you get that area too bright, it actually floats off the surface. So it looks more wooden and it looks like it's closer to us. And if you draw it the right value, then it really sits into that bigger area. So it's really crucial that you look carefully at that area and squint and make sure that it's not too bright. Now, something I really like about this reference is how much of the eye falls into shadow. Now, there's a great history of hiding the eye in shadow. If you get a chance, you should look up the work by Rembrandt, and he did this quite often, especially in his self-portraits, where he would have his eyes, or at least one eye, shrouded in shadow. And it's something that really gets the viewer to look closely at the face. We want to see the eyes, so we look closely at his painted faces and look into those shadows. And if you see the paintings in person, it's quite often surprising how little he's painted. He's just suggested exactly what he needs to capture the look of the eye in shadow. Now, of course, line is an important part of drawing. But I find when you're working on an image like this, where value is so important, it's good to ask yourself questions about why you can see the things that appear before you. So when you're looking at her face and we see this edge, I can start out with a line, but it's really not a line that makes that apparent. It's a value. It's light over dark. So while you're working, continue to ask yourself, why can I see that? Why is that showing up the way it is? And that will help you then in knowing what value to use. So as I'm drawing the hair, it's darker in value as I squint. It really is, in some areas, the darkest dark. And so now I can bring that darker value in along the face, and that will make that reflected light show up. Now I can flash my eye back and forth and see if there's any movement in that angle as I look back and forth. For now it looks pretty close. I think I can go on and I'll come back and double check that in a little while once I've gotten a little bit more finished. In this part of the face, it's really important to look at overlap and how you have part of the form as it comes down the zygomatic bone. You can see how there's actually a part of that zygomatic area that's in front of the cheek behind it. And so you want to capture that as well. There's a little bit of a value change. So even as you're sketching it in, you can look for areas that overlap. So a line comes in front of another, and then there's a little bit of a shadow. So try to capture those subtleties. And you can build up, you can gradually build up those values that capture that sense of overlap. But it's good to be aware of them as you're working. So here again, as you come down, you can see it. It tucks in just a little bit here, and then the cheek comes out behind. It's very easy to exaggerate the form, and that's why switching back and forth between positive and negative shapes is so important, especially when drawing a woman's face, because they usually have very subtle and soft curves and shapes and transitions of plane, and so you don't want to exaggerate those areas and miss the opportunity to draw those really subtle curves. Okay, so I've gotten the one side of her face blocked in, so I'm now going to move into the nose area and try to capture that shape. So now I can find the placement of the eye. So again, if I want to place the eye, I want to look at the nose. I want to make sure that I've gotten that shape correct and accurately drawn, because that will set up then the positioning of the eye. Remember, when we drop a plumb line, usually the outside corner of the alar wing lines up with the inside corner of the eye. So once I have figured out where that alar wing is located, I can go straight up and find approximately where the eye will begin. Now to block this in, I'm going to try to find the overall shadow shape first. So I can squint and I can see how that whole eye socket area falls into shadow. There's a little bit of light on the muscle above the eye. Now that I've found that basic shape, I can go back in and I can pull out the actual feature and the details of the eye. If you've ever played on a sports team or gone to a summer camp and had a team photo, and then years later you go back and look at that team photo, even if the heads are really tiny, you can recognize everybody. And it's amazing that you can, that even at that scale, you can recognize all of your friends. And it really comes down to the fact that all of us, because of our face structure, have a unique set of light and shadow shapes. So even at a small scale, you can recognize people because of those light and shadow shapes. So that's why it's so important to nail those down when drawing, because that really gives you the likeness. More so than just drawing individual eyes and the nose and the mouth. how they fit into that field of value on the face. Now in this case, I can use a horizontal plumb line. I can see that her eyes are in line, her head's not tilted. So if I've already established where the bottom of the iris is on one side, I can carry that over to the other and find the eye within that shadow shape. I can also use that plumb line technique with her mouth. I can figure out approximately where the corner of her mouth is. Remember, that usually lines up with the center of the eye, in this case, just to the left of her iris. Now in this case, as I'm drawing the eye, something doesn't look quite right. As I'm drawing in the iris, the shape of the whites of the eye, the lids, but instead of stopping and editing and starting over, I'm just going to continue drawing and trust my eye and see if I've drawn it accurately or not. If I haven't, then I can go back and just erase lightly over what I have and use that information to try it again. But don't edit too quickly. Let your eye guide you, and you'll know once you get it done whether or not it's accurate. But I find quite often that if I jump in too quickly and start over again, I actually find out that I was right the first time, and now I'm just having to redraw it all over again when I wouldn't have had to. So trust your eye and wait until you're done before you actually make those edits. Now that I've finished the eye on the right, which is her left eye, now I can start looking back at the other shapes I've drawn and start comparing them, making sure that those are accurate. Now, there are many different approaches in drawing a face, and this is just one approach. A lot of artists actually, when they work, they really want to interpret and plus what they see or add to what they see. And I find that I just love capturing this person, and I really want to make sure I'm doing all I can to reproduce just the beauty of a face. So that's why I take a lot of time in going back over again and again to make sure that I can get it as accurate as possible. Because I don't want to draw just any face or my interpretation of a face. I want to draw her face. Again, that's not the way everyone works, but I find it's just something that I've always loved to do. So when that's the case, I find that it takes me actually longer to draw because I'm constantly going back over and making sure that I'm drawing with accuracy. And that doesn't mean that there won't be any artistic input or selection of what I think is most important or my interpretation of what I'm seeing. But for me, I really want to make sure that I'm capturing the beauty of the face, that particular face, as much as possible. One of the wonderful things about being an artist is that you get to study these beautiful shapes that occur in the face or in the landscape or in an animal. And most people don't have that opportunity, or they haven't been trained in how to see these beautiful shapes. And they really appreciate them when they see them in a painting. So that's one of the best things about being an artist. You can teach people to see these beautiful shapes that occur around us that we rarely have time or the interest in stopping and studying them. So in looking at these shapes on her face, they're really beautiful. Just the negative shapes between, say, the bottom of the nostril area and the alar wing and the top lip. It's really a beautiful shape. And it goes back to what I was talking about with cast drawing and how you really can fall in love with light and just how it falls on the surface of a form and creates really beautiful light and shadow shapes. what I really love about this approach of looking for those shapes, really focusing on those light and shadow shapes, it really applies to any subject. So some people love to draw animals, wildlife, horses, dogs. Other people like to draw landscapes or portraits of people. But it's the same approach. And so once you learn this, you really can draw any subject. And it helps to know something about that subject. So I'm not downplaying the importance of knowing the anatomy of an animal or knowing something about the landscape, if that's what you really want to draw or paint. But if you follow these basic steps of looking for shapes, looking for negative and positive shapes and the light and shadow shapes, it really then gives you the tools to go out and draw and paint anything, because it's really the same process. All right, so now I'm going to bring in this shadow that's cast along the light side of her face. Because that enclosed shape, again, always looking for enclosed shapes, really can be helpful. Because they're much easier to see and to measure. And I'd mentioned Sherlock Holmes earlier. This is where it becomes almost like a visual detective, where when you're drawing and you're wanting to capture that likeness, then you really have to become a detective and start looking at shapes. And if something doesn't look quite right, then going back through and trying to find where the problem lies and where you've gotten off track. So in that way, it's actually fun. It's not wrestling with failure or thinking that the piece of art isn't good because it's not totally accurate the first time through. But going back through and saying, okay, I know something is off. Now, what would it be? And just keep continuing to work hard at it, not giving up. And in this case, now that I've drawn this shadow in, this will give me more information so I can look over the form and try to detect any errors that might have crept in. While working on a project with Disney many years ago, I learned something called shape integrity, and it was from a film called Pocahontas, and we looked carefully at the work of J.C. Leyendecker and Alphonse Mucha, N.C. Wyeth. And the idea behind the style was that everything had a shape. A light shape, a shadow shape, didn't matter. Everything was carved out. Now, those shapes could have soft edges, but they had integrity. They just weren't smudges or smears. And so it was really a challenge, but it was a great education in how powerful an image can be if you pay attention to those shapes. And if you go back and look at the work of J.C. Leyendecker, who was just a brilliant illustrator, or Alphonse Mucha, both a painter and an illustrator, they paid attention to those shapes. And when you look at their work, they have such a presence and such a strength. And that was something we tried to achieve in the layouts and in the backgrounds. All right, I'm at the point now where I'm going to start again. I'm going to go back to my basic shapes, flash my eye back and forth, try to discover where my shapes aren't quite as accurate, or maybe the position of something isn't quite accurate. So I've gotten enough up on the screen now that I can make some decisions about maybe the angle of the eye that isn't quite right, or the length of the mouth. So I'm just going to go back over and erase some of those shapes so I can give myself a little bit more room to move with the values. And remember, you can do this when you're working traditionally. You can take a kneaded eraser and you can roll it, and then roll it over your drawing, and it will leave a ghost image. So you can work on top, and then that way you don't have to start all over again. If you erase sometimes, you can erase everything. But if you roll over it, or in this case, just take an eraser, and I put the opacity at about 50, then you can pull up some of the marks that you've made, but still have enough that you can work from and decide where to go from that point. That experience of working in the Disney studio also taught me a number of things, that it's always too early to quit and it's never too late to change. So if you're drawing and it's not quite right, well, it's always too early to quit. You always can make it better. You always can go back in and make corrections. And I know for my work that happens all the time, where I constantly have to make corrections, both big and small. So it's always too early to quit, but then it's never too late to make changes. So if you look at your work and something is not right, then I would go back in and just keep working until you get it closer to what you're seeing, what's in front of you. Now, there does come a time when you do have to stop and you don't want to overwork something, but I think it's much better to go in and risk overworking the piece than leaving something that could have been better. And if you can surround yourself with good artists, that really can help. I think that was one of the great blessings of working at a big studio, where so many artists were so gifted that you really could see how hard people have to work to master a craft like drawing or painting or animating. And so if you can create a group of friends and who are interested in art and who can look at your work and give you feedback, honest feedback, it really will help your development. And when you're looking at someone's work, it's always best to try to find something that is working before you launch into finding things that don't work. And then try to be a friend of that project. Try to find ways of making it better and how you could help someone improve their work. And then if someone has criticism about your work, don't take it personally. They're trying to help you get better. So, and that's hard because we get attached to our artwork and don't always like to hear when things aren't successful. But that is a way of getting better, of letting people look at your work and give you honest feedback. Now with her iris here, I'm using the background tone to erase some of those areas, to go back in and alter the shape to make sure that it's more accurate. And then just constantly be looking across the form, so you're comparing it with something else. So you're not just drawing in isolation. Okay, I'm going to go back in and strengthen this tone again. Remember, we talked about planes before. So as we're working through the face, we're thinking of not only light and shadow shapes, but the planes that are causing those light and shadow shapes. So across her forehead, you can see how this plane right above her eye is getting the most light. And then it gets slightly dimmer, that front plane. And then that third plane turns into shadow. If we squint, we can see how the top of her forehead really flows right into the hair. So that's a really beautiful soft edge, and that's something we'll want to capture. I can really go in and darken some of the shadow and really melt some of those edges. But never stop drawing. So as you're working in value, as you're dropping in big value shapes, continue to look at the shapes in front of you in the model. And so you're constantly drawing, you're constantly thinking about the shapes that you're making and making sure that they're going in the right place and they're the right size. And see how that shadow flows right into her upper lip. And I can go back in and soften those edges. They're really some beautiful soft edges. I can do the same on this side, where as we squint, the shadow above that eyelid flows into the eyelid, into the iris area where the pupil is located. So I can reestablish that shadow, and that also will help me with accuracy, because once I get that shadow drawn in, and then I can go back and check that shape and see how accurate it is in placement and proportion. It's also good to remember that while we're talking about accuracy and we're talking about drawing what you see and the importance of looking carefully at what's in front of you, how you feel about the work as you're working on it, or how you feel about the subject, really can come through the drawing. So it's not just about the technique or the accuracy. There's an artist I worked with at Disney who was a brilliant painter from China, and he talked about how what you're feeling about that subject really comes through the work. And if you're excited about the light and shadow shapes, then the people will respond when they see that work as well. So keep that in mind as you're working, that it's not just that you're a hand or a head, that your heart is involved. Really, everything about you is involved. Everything that you've learned and everything you can bring to that image will also come through that painting or that drawing. All right, so now I'm at a point where I can go back in and go back over these areas that I've already sketched in and blocked in. And try again, try to make them a little bit more like what I'm seeing in the model. Checking the edges, remember squinting as you look through your eyelashes, and any edge that disappears completely when you squint, that's going to be probably your softest edge. Any edge that remains sharp when you squint, that's probably going to be your sharpest. There's a really nice core shadow right along her eyeball, which is really kind of an amazing shape, so I'll definitely want to capture that. There's some structure to the eye. You can see how, as I mentioned earlier, the lid wraps around the eyeball. So even though it's in shadow and it's very subtle, it is something that we can see, and it gives boundary to the eye and a lot of emotion to the eye in that area. So we want to capture that. There's also a reflected light just under her eyebrow, which is really nice. And we can drop that in and then drop it back. So when you first draw it, it'll probably be a little bit too bright, but then you can squint and see how it fits in with that larger value area, that field of value. Now, there's a lot of subtlety in the contour near her zygomatic bone. It's really helpful if you can find a vertical. If you were actually drawing this person from life, in the room there might be a vertical line that you could see and that you could compare to those subtle curves of the zygomatic bone. In this case, there's a line because of the screen I'm using, and I can use that. So anything that you can use, even if you hold up your pencil to create an artificial barrier or line that you then can look at and create a negative shape between her cheek and the background. So if you have a straight line, look for that. It really can help gauge those real subtle curves that otherwise are pretty difficult to nail accurately. So this slight reflection on her right eye, which is on our left, is definitely one of those areas that you could get away with a smudge. But if you think back to, say, Alphonse Mucha or J.C. Leyendecker, they would carve that shape out, and it gives more strength, and it actually captures what's happening in the form. So squint, try to see that shape. You can always soften the edges and make sure that it starts out as a shape. And that'll bring a lot more strength to your work. A greater sense of form. Remember I said when we were drawing the eye that the cornea, that's that clear cap above the pupil and the iris, it causes the upper eyelid to bow out slightly, and you can see it. It's very subtle, but you can see it in her eye, how there's just a little bit of a bowing out of the upper lid as it goes across the cornea. And that's where knowledgeable observation comes in handy. So if you've done the work and you've studied anatomy and read up on just the construction of the face, then you start looking for things that you might otherwise miss. So it really is a combination of drawing what you see, but also knowing something about what you're drawing, because then it'll be easier to find those things, to look for them, and make sense of them when you do see them. There was another portrait painter that I had an opportunity to do a workshop with, and he kept telling all those who were attending the workshop that if you could draw at the beginning, you could draw at the end. So in some techniques, in some master techniques, the drawing would be nailed down first, and they'd spend a lot of time painting monochromatically, and then they would glaze over with color on top. And so in that case, they would spend a lot of time up front with the drawing. But in this case, when you're sketching a portrait or even painting something called alla prima, where you're not relying on the underpainting as much, if you can draw at the beginning, you can draw at the end. So I just try to keep drawing and try to make the drawing more accurate the longer I work on it. And I find that really helps me get a likeness because I'm constantly drawing. I'm never really moving out of the drawing phase into something else. It's always focusing on the shapes, going back over again with a fresh eye. If you take a break and come back, that's a great time to stop and not just jump back in to where you left off, but you're starting with a fresh eye. It's one of the few times you can actually see this and see it, how it actually appears, where you're not used to those errors. And so take some time, go right back to the beginning, go back to your drawing in your mind. You don't have to actually restart the drawing, but think through each step, whether it's the shapes, the values, the edges. And once you've done that, if you've done that for a few minutes, then you can jump back in where you've left off. But every time you do that, you make the drawing a little bit stronger, and you can pick up on any errors that might have slipped under the radar. And then have other people look at your work as well, whether they're artists or not. Have other people give you feedback. And then take that to heart and try to improve on those things that other people are seeing in your work that may need work. And that was another thing that turned out to be such an important part of my career at Disney, was having artists, world-class artists, look at my work every day and challenge every line and shape and value. And it makes you a better artist. So take advantage of that and try to get people to look at your work and give you honest feedback. When we're comparing values, one of the darkest lines you'll find is this line above the eyelid. It's the fold where the muscle folds down and the eyelid protrudes from underneath. And it's usually a pretty dark line. And that's I find a good drawing line as well. If you can capture that line accurately, it really can capture the shape of the eye. So that's an area that I would really spend some time working on, flashing your eye back and forth, making sure you have the correct angle. Now, one area that I want to look at is this light area on the nose. I think that's going to help us with the placement of the eye. So I want to double check that, and I look at this shape. It's kind of a funny bear shape. So bring that back here. Yeah, so I think that's one issue I'm having. I think the eye is shifted a little bit too far to the right. So what I can do is I can take my eraser, go back over, and just lightly erase some of that. I can also, in Photoshop, I can create another layer and sample the background. And then create a slight glaze. So I'm just glazing over with that color. So I'll still see the ghost image. Now I actually could select it and move the eye, but I'd rather redraw it. So I'll look at that negative shape again, make sure that I draw that correctly. And this is why I think it's so important looking for these shapes, because you really can create a check and balance system for your drawing. So you're always checking back and forth between these shapes, making sure you're drawing with accuracy. And then if you find that something isn't quite right, then I would just jump back in and measure and look at those shapes and see if you can make it a little bit more accurate. I think her nose could be slightly narrower, so we can trim that down a little bit. That'll also help bring that eye in, because remember, everything is in relationship to one another. So if you're drawing the eye, you need to make sure that you're thinking in terms of that nose and where that's located. So it looks like the corner of the eye could be right about there. So let's redraw that. And now that I have that other information drawn, I can just follow those lines that I've already drawn and shift the eye over. All right, so I can block in the shadows, and that'll give me a better indication of whether or not this is an improvement. And I think it is. So let me go back in and carve away at that iris shape using the background tone. Trying to get that shape correct. Something else I found helpful is not only to look at the small shapes. So I'm looking at the shape that's just adjacent to the iris, this little shape just off to the right. So those small shapes can be helpful, but then switch and look at the bigger shape. Look at the entire eye, opening of the eye. Look at the entire face in the light or in the shadow. So go back and forth between those small shapes that'll help you draw with more accuracy, but then switch over and make sure you're always looking at the bigger shape, that you never lose sight of the bigger shape. All right, so it wasn't really that major a change, but I think it does help with the drawing of her face. Now, while there's a beautiful soft edge up here on her forehead, hopefully you can see that core shadow that runs right along the edge of that shadow. And that's important to get, because that's going to create a little bit more dimension, that sense of roundness, give you that reflected light. Let me continue to sketch out the rest of her head and hair. Again, always looking for shapes. When it comes to hair, it's really easy to start looking at individual strands of hair. But this is where I think carving comes in handy. If you were going to carve this portrait and you were going to do an accurate representation of a hair, obviously you couldn't start out with strands. You'd have to begin just with big planes. And once you carve out those planes, you can go back in and start pulling out individual strands of hair, but then those individual strands of hair then have a place to go. It makes more sense where you're placing them, because you've already created the foundational shapes. Use plumb lines and see where that shape actually stops. I can shift that over slightly. Now, where the hair meets the forehead, it's always a soft edge. And be careful, it'll be tempting to draw that as a sharp edge. And you can draw that initially with a stronger line as a construction line, but you definitely want to go back in and soften that edge. Otherwise, it looks very unnatural with that hard edge along the forehead. All right, so I'm just blocking this in right now, and then we can go back in and we can pull out a little bit more detail. We can draw in the shoulder. Again, if I'm drawing the shoulder, I'm looking how it corresponds with the rest of the face. So I'm not drawing it in isolation. I can begin to look at this negative shape just to the right of her hair. That can give me the overall shape of the head. All right, so I'm going to go in and on a separate layer, I'm going to start blocking in some of the light shapes that I see. Now, this may seem like this is the final touch or the last value we'll place in, but just like in creating a tone, once you put in your lights, it's much easier to see the drawing. So the drawing never stops. So as I put in these shapes, I'm sure errors in proportion and placement will jump out. So don't be afraid to make those corrections. Once you drop in your lights, step back and take another look and see if you can find ways of making it stronger. And look for those errors that were hard to see when you didn't have the lighter value. When dropping in these lighter values, think of planes. The planes of the face. Remember we talked about looking for the planes. They usually come in threes. Now I know that some of these values are a bit rough. I can always go back in and smooth over them. So at this point I'm more concerned about just the light shapes than I am the way that this lighter value is going down to the surface. And so I'm actually drawing in those negative shapes that I was looking at before. So this is where you want to switch back and forth between negative and positive shapes. So before I was just staring at this empty shape that was between the bottom of the nose and the upper lip, and now I can actually paint it in, and then I can flash my eye back and forth and see how accurate it was and see if there's any way I can improve what I had drawn initially. And go back in and hit some of those highlight areas, which will help me develop the form a little bit more. And I'm hoping that you're seeing in this approach that it takes a lot of the pressure off of drawing. You're not having that pressure of, I must get it right, absolutely from the very start. So you can constantly go back in and improve and flash your eye back and forth, keep squinting, and gradually the drawing will get more in focus and be more of a likeness. And the more you practice, the easier it will be, the faster you'll be, the less work you may have to put in capturing a likeness. Just keep reminding yourself it's always too early to quit. It's never too late to make changes. All right, so now I'm going to go back in. Now that I have just the light shape carved in a little bit more, I'm going to go in and take my opacity way down. I'm going to go back over my shadow area and just strengthen this shadow shape because it's such a strong shape in the reference. I want to make sure that I'm capturing that. And also I want to make sure that these reflected lights don't break the overall shadow shape. So with reflected light, you really have to be careful because while it's there, if you paint it too bright, it breaks up that shape. It pulls it apart. It no longer feels and looks like a solid area. And this will also help. So once I drop this in, I'll be able to go back and look again, check again, and see how accurate my shapes are. I want you to remember that the more information you give yourself in your drawing, the easier it will be to know what to do next or what to improve. So I find it helpful to try to keep the drawing going and making sure that all the areas are at about the same level of finish. And making sure that your edges don't get too sharp. I mentioned that before, that if you have too many sharp edges, they really can be distracting because sharp edges grab the attention of the eye, and so you want to make sure that you're not leaving too many sharp edges on your drawing as you work. And so as I'm pulling in these darker values, now I really can see what's working and what needs improvement because it looks closer to my reference. So the more information I can give myself in my drawing, the easier it will be to improve and to know what to do next. All right, so now that I've done that, I've dropped those values in. I can flash my eye back and forth and see what needs to happen next. And I think changing the angle of her gaze is the next thing. So we can go back in, we can stare at these really subtle light shapes. So obviously, a drawing is important, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. But at the same time, you don't want it to become precious. One of the great lessons in working in an animation studio is that nothing is precious. No matter how much work you put into a drawing or a painting or a scene, it always can be changed, and usually changed for the better. So as you're working, don't be afraid to make those changes and be honest with yourself. If there are things that just aren't working, then go back and correct them. All right, so I think that's a little bit closer to the shape in her right eye on our left. I have to make that a little bit smaller. Again, I like what I had, and I was tempted to leave it because I liked it so much, but it wasn't correct. So I need to go back in and change it, and I can always draw it again. And I think we can move this eye slightly over just by looking at the negative shape of the white of the eye. And I can switch back over and do the positive shape of the iris. And then flash my eye back and forth, make sure that I have the correct size and placement. Now this is a very subtle line along her lower lid. I'm just going to use a line right now as a stand-in to try to get the shape correct, and then I'll go back in and erase it, paint over it. I don't want a real harsh line there. But I can start out with a line and then paint back over it and capture something of that light. And you can see it how the upper portion of the eyeball is in shadow. If I squint, it really gets pretty dark, and you almost lose it in the upper lid. And then it gradually gets lighter. And then we have this lower lid, which it's a shelf that usually does catch a lot of light. It's usually turned up towards the light, and you don't want to miss that opportunity to paint the thickness of the lower lid. There's something really beautiful about that lower lid catching the light. So it's definitely something you want to include. And that is a common error that I see in student work, making the lower lid as if it has no thickness at all. It is quite thick. Now this cast shadow on her face from her hair seems like it would have a very sharp edge. And if I stare right at that edge, it does look fairly sharp. But if I squint and compare it with the absolute sharpest edge, it's nowhere near as sharp. And in overall looking at her face, I think the sharpest edge I see, and it's quite often right above the zygomatic bone along the orbit, because the bone is right near the surface. So that's probably our sharpest edge. So when I compare those two, then this seemingly sharp edge now can be softened. And someone I've worked with in the past has said, when in doubt, make it a soft edge, because usually the edges are soft. We think of them as sharp, but they really aren't. They're most often soft. You can see along the nose how it takes a little bit of a change in direction. And then note how the edge changes. So now we get down to the ball of the nose. Since it is more of a rounded form, it's going to have a softer edge, so we can really soften that edge and capture something of that roundness. And then don't forget about the integrity of the shapes. You want to make sure that you're focusing on the shapes, and then you can soften the edges. There's a little bit of a cast shadow on her lower lip from the upper lip, so it's slightly darker. And remember, the mouth wraps around the teeth, so we're seeing the mouth in a foreshortened view because it's pulling away from us. Another lesson I learned in the layout department, creating the backgrounds, designing them, and then handing them off to painters who would paint them. You can begin to hear a rhythm, whether it's the composition or the beat of your light and shadow shapes. It sounds strange, but it creates an actual visual beat. And so you can begin to see the rhythm of a shape and hear that rhythm as well. And the more you look at great arts, the more you look at great compositions, you can begin to sense that rhythm and how much art really has in common with music. And there's a rhythm to the face that you can study as well. I was talking about the gesture of the face, and there is a real subtle rhythm to shapes in the face, whether it's the nose, the area I'm drawing right now, or the upper lip. And maybe it's because I played drums for so long, but as I flash my eye back and forth, there's almost a cymbal crash when I see something out of line. So try to tune into those subtleties of shape and rhythm and see if you can hear them as well as see them. All right, so I think I'm getting closer. Go in and just reestablish the lights one more time. Then we'll look and see where we are, see if we can find areas of improvement. But we're never leaving the drawing phase. Anytime you're putting something on the drawing, whether it's a light value or you're erasing, constantly be thinking of drawing. And it's also the same when you're painting. You're just drawing with color. So you always want to be thinking in terms of the drawing. You never really move out of that phase. You're constantly checking and rechecking. See that although the upper lip, she has lipstick on, looks like it's a sharp edge. If I stare right at it, it does look sharp. But again, if I compare it to a sharp edge off of here, it's nowhere near as sharp. You want to capture some of the light on her lip, her lower lip. When painting or drawing highlights, remember you need to first capture that value field behind the highlight, underneath the highlight. Otherwise, the highlight will drift off the surface. So an artist mentioned in a book I read that you have to earn the right to put the highlights in. You can't just drop them in. You have to make sure that you've first studied the overall values and gotten those close, and then you can drop in that highlight. But only then. All right, so I could continue just refining, going back in and going back and forth between light and shadow shapes, bringing in a little bit more detail, but thinking not so much as detail, but just breaking those bigger shapes into smaller ones and trying to capture the light wherever I can see it. But I think for now, we're in a good place to stop. So remember, when you're working on these, to go from big to small, you can work from the outside in, or in this case, we worked from the inside out. Always check your shapes, flash your eye back and forth, and then never be satisfied if something isn't quite right. It's always too early to quit, but it's never too late to change. So just go right back in. If you see something that doesn't look right, we can look at it backwards. Remember, that's a good way of getting a fresh eye, or we can take a break, come back, and make sure that we've captured the images as closely as possible. So when we come back again, we'll do another head, and we'll use the same process. This time we'll do it traditionally.